Welcome to Astonishing Discoveries in the Land of the Bible. The first session, we talked about Egypt, and it was a fascinating journey. The last session, we talked about Babylon and Sumer in the quest for power. And right now, we will talk about some of the greatest discoveries in the land of Israel, or mostly in the land of Israel. Let me begin with Tyre, which is really not exactly in the land of Israel right now, would be where Lebanon is today. It's a famous, well-known port in the Mediterranean Sea. It was an important trading center in the ancient world and a powerful city that rivaled Carthage, which was really a colony. It was a colony of Tyre that rivaled Rome. So at one point, Tyre was actually more important than Rome itself. It stretches out for about 20 miles along the shore, but you can see fairly little of Tyre today. It was densely populated. It was a very major city, extremely strategic in the Mediterranean coast. But Tyre was destroyed. And the Bible has something to say about Tyre. And this is what we want to do, to see how the Bible texts intersect with what archaeology has discovered lately. You have a Tyre, the harbor of Tyre, and it's a well-known harbor because you could get in through two sections. In some of the greatest ships were able to get in there in a natural harbor. But Ezekiel 26 makes a prediction about Tyre that reads this way. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Tyre, and will cause many nations to come up against you. And they shall destroy the walls of Tyre and break down her towers. I will also scrape her dust from her and make her like the top of a rock. It shall be a place for spreading nets in the midst of the sea. And continues in verse 19, chapter of Ezekiel 28, You have become a horror, and it shall be no more forever. And in chapter 26, Behold, I will bring against Tyre from the north Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses, with chariots, and with horsemen, and with an army, with many people. And he will slay with the sword your daughter villages, and in the fields, in the villages, in the fields. He will heap up a siege mound against you, and build a wall against you, and raise a defense against you. He will direct his battering rams against your walls, and with his axes he will break down your towers. This is a very dire prediction against Tyre. Not only does it say that Tyre will be destroyed, it gives specific details as to how bad off it would be. It would be scraped off like the top of the rock. There would be only nets hanging over the place where once was a thriving city. It will be taken over by Nebuchadnezzar, naming a specific king. In fact, in the NIV we find these verses 12 to 14 of chapter 26 of Ezekiel. They will plunder your wealth and loot your merchandise. They will break down your walls and demolish your fine houses and throw your stones, timber, and rubble into the sea. You will never be rebuilt, for I, the Lord, have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. So, it tells us with such specificity that a lot of people in ancient times, and a lot of scholars said, well, this is really something. How could it possibly be that a prediction can be fulfilled with such a step-by-step specificity? Basically, what we have is 6 predictions here about Tyre. Nebuchadnezzar would attack the city. Tyre would be cast into the city, literally cast into the sea. Their stones, parts of the city, would be cast into the sea. Tyre would become bare like the top of a rock. Other nations would come up against Tyre, other nations besides Nebuchadnezzar. Fishermen would spread nets over the site, and Tyre would never be rebuilt. Did that happen? Since the prophecy was made when Tyre was one of the preeminent cities in the ancient world, some Bible students have thought the chances for fulfillment to be about 1 in 75 million. What are the chances that this would actually take place? Well, Let's examine some of those claims. And one of them is that Nebuchadnezzar would attack the city of Tyre. Did that happen? Of course it did. Shortly after Ezekiel's prophecy, which was in the year 590 BC, then Nebuchadnezzar attacked the city of Tyre just at the time that he destroyed the city of Jerusalem the same year in the same campaign. He laid siege to it. He destroyed it a number of years later, about 13 years later. A second prediction that Tyre would be cast into the sea, the city would be cast into the sea. Well, it was laid in ruins it laid in ruins for about 250 years. What happened? Alexander the Great came in the year 333 during the war with the Persians, and he scraped the ruins of Tyre, because when Nebuchadnezzar attacked the city, then the locals who survived rebuilt the city, but not where Tyre was. They rebuilt the city in an island about a half a mile away into the sea, and they did it there in order to be more secure from any land attackers, such as in the case of Nebuchadnezzar. Alexander came along, and he saw that the city had moved a half mile away into the ocean, and built a causeway to get to attack it. Now, this would take some effort to do. You can imagine half a mile of sea between you and that island. Well, he did that because Alexander the Great was one of those guys who didn't take a no for an answer, and he used whatever mechanism possible to accomplish his goals. Tyre would then become a bare like a top of a rock. Sure enough, it scraped all of those seashore buildings and houses and rubble, and used all of that to dump it into the sea to get to it. In fact, this is an artist's rendition of what that might have been like. But Alexander had conquered a number of nations on the way there, and he recruited every one of those people to help him accomplish his goal. That is fulfilling another one of those predictions, that other nations would go up against Tyre. What do you find in Tyre today? Today is a small fishing village. It has not been rebuilt by any stretch of the imagination to the extent that it was when it was a major port, a critical strategic city in the ancient world. It is basically a fishing village, and you see a lot of fishermen casting their nets, just like the Bible had predicted. The Bible predicted a number of other things. The Bible talks about a number of other issues and names in Scripture that sometimes are not corroborated by outside sources for hundreds and even thousands of years. One of those names was the name of David. Dr. Hazel, come and tell us a little bit about David and what we have found. This is an interesting cover from National Geographic about David. Tell us a little bit about David and what scholars have said about David, and whether or not we have outside information about his real life.
Good, thank you. David has been in the middle, David and Solomon have been in the middle of a major controversy in the last 20 years or so. Many scholars, among postmodern scholars, have doubted whether David even existed as an individual. Until just a few years ago, we didn't have any evidence for David outside of the Bible in terms of written records. The same can be said for Solomon. And so we have a real controversy that has been raging since about 1990, maybe even the late 80s or so. David is a major figure in ancient history. When you think about it, without David, there would be no united monarchy. Without David, there would be no capital city of Jerusalem, which still serves as a capital after 3,000 years today. I was there in Jerusalem in 1996 when they celebrated the 3,000-year anniversary of the city of Jerusalem, and I remember standing across from the wonderful Israel Museum, looking at the valley as they portrayed David slaying Goliath with a laser light show on the walls of that massive museum. And then fireworks. They hired someone from New York City to come in and create a firework display that rivals any 4th of July here in this country, even New York's 4th of July. And it was a great celebration. Thousands of people were out on the street celebrating that evening, the 3,000-year anniversary. Without David, there wouldn't be synagogues and churches around the world today worshiping the liturgy that David wrote in the book of Psalms, so much of the liturgy that we still sing and still recite today. Without David, in fact, we wouldn't even have the Messiah that is promised in the Old Testament through the line of Jesse, his father, and through David. In fact, David is mentioned more frequently than any other person in biblical history, from the first few pages of the book of Samuel all the way down to the very last chapter of the book of Revelation. Last weekend, I was speaking at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles in a symposium to several hundred people. 4 of us presenters were there, and we were discussing the history of David and Solomon, which just made the National Geographic cover in December of this past year, 2010. And here you see the famous painting of King David and the controversy that is being discussed here about this ancient king. What do we know about him today? The site that I'm currently working at in Israel as a senior partner with the Hebrew University is featured in this National Geographic issue, and we are in the middle of this controversy right now as we speak. But even before that time, in 1992, a very well-known Old Testament scholar from the University of Sheffield in England published a book that caused waves throughout the scholarly community, especially in biblical studies. The book was entitled In Search of Ancient Israel, and in this book, Professor Philip Davies, argued that David, not only his kingdom was questioned, but the whole history of Israel was questioned. He writes on page 26, "The Israel of biblical literature is, at least for the most part, not an historical entity at all." For Davies and other postmodern scholars, mostly from European universities, but this is spreading to other places as well, for Davies and others, the biblical literature that we read about today, that didn't get written until the time of Alexander the Great, until the time of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, hundreds and hundreds of years after the stories it records or supposedly records about. And so for them, all of this is not real history. He goes on to say that, in fact, David and Solomon are mythical figures, no more historical than the King Curtis and the King Arthurs of ancient or maybe more modern British folklore. So what you have here is a whole story that has evolved over time about these heroes of the Bible that probably have no historical reality at all. Now, this is a huge challenge, as we mentioned, to the not only Judeo-Christian traditions, but to the very fabric of Western society today. And that challenge has been met by a number of scholars. It's interesting that one of Davies' main arguments, and many of the scholars, other archaeologists today that are making similar arguments, those arguments come from silence. Davies' main argument was that we don't have the faintest trace in the archaeological record as yet of David and Solomon. Therefore, they probably didn't exist. Well, an argument from silence is never a good scientific argument to make. And in the field of archaeology, where there are literally hundreds of archaeologists working in the field every single year, that is a very dangerous assertion to make, because you never know what's going to be found the very next season or maybe a few years down the road. And in fact, that's precisely what happened. This book was published in 1992. In 1993, right at the entrance of Tel Dan, the northernmost site in Israel, from here you can look across the valley into Lebanon and up into the Golan Heights that used to belong to Syria. Here at this important site, and the Bible always describes the borders of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, we have an amazing discovery made in 1993 outside the city gate that you're looking at here in the foreground. Reused as paving stones, several pieces of stone were found in 1993 and 1994 that comprise a part of a larger stela or victory inscription by Hazael, one of the Aramean kings mentioned in the Bible, who attacked Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom of Judah during that time period. And here we have specifically mentioned his victory against the house of Israel, and then one line down, against the house of David. The house of David being a reference to the southern kingdom of Judah that David had established some years earlier. This dates, by the way, about 140 to 160 years after the time of David, but it remembers David as the founder, and it uses the very same terminology that the Bible, the Old Testament, uses in reference to David and the house of David as a reference to Judah. So this was an amazing discovery. Of course, it was dramatic enough. It was mentioned in many, many different articles here. Biblical Archaeology Review, the most popular biblical archaeology magazine, says, "A dramatic find confirmed the historicity of David, king of Israel. A team of archaeologists digging in northern Galilee found a remarkable inscription from the 9th century BC that refers both to the house of David and to the king of Israel." It made the cover of the New York Times, and newspapers all across the world covered this story. Today, most scholars have no doubt that David existed. But there are some scholars today that continue to question whether the kingdom that David and Solomon established was really the massive kingdom that is described in the Old Testament, whether it might not be somewhat diminished from that. And the National Geographic issue that just came out talks about this issue in quite some detail. The focus of the discussion today is around an area between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Next week I'm going to be there again with the group. And this is an area in the heart of Judah where a new site has been discovered called Khirbet Qeiyafa, has been excavated only for the last few years, and it is calling into question some of the assumptions of some of the archaeologists that are questioning the history of David. Israel Finkelstein has written two very popular books, one entitled The Bible Unearthed, the other David and Solomon, in which he argues that the literacy described in the Bible for David and Solomon is not really evident. There's no evidence for extensive literacy. He says there's no evidence for the intrigues and wars described in the Bible between David, the Philistines, and others. He says that there is no evidence for major fortified cities in the land of Judah during this time, as the Bible describes David and Solomon building. And he says there is evidence, or perhaps a lack of evidence, in Jerusalem for an extensive city. So he argues that Jerusalem was just a tiny little village with a small hinterland, not at all the extensive boundaries that we read about in the Bible and that is depicted here in this particular slide. So there is a very real move on the part of some scholars to revise the history of Israel, to downplay what the Bible describes about Israel here as well. Recently, we have been involved in a new project that goes to the very core and very heart of this issue. 1 Samuel 17, 1 through 3, introduces the story of David and Goliath. And here it says, in this very detailed description of the geographical area in which this campaign took place, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah." For many of us, these are just names that we read in the Bible, but we can place these also in the land, as we'll see in a moment. "They encamped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephes Damim." Hebrew, the Ephes Damim, which is an exact transliteration of the Hebrew, means boundary of blood. They camped at the boundary of blood. This was the boundary between Philistia and Judah at that time, where wars took place and much blood was shed. "And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and the Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them." This detailed geography tells us exactly how the armies were positioned. And if we go back to that territory today, we don't have to fly there from South Bend or Chicago today. We can be there through this wonderful satellite technology and look down on that valley. We can see where Succoth is located and has been identified, though it's not been excavated yet. We can see Azekah, which was excavated in the late 1800s by the British and the Irish team that was working there. And we approximately see perhaps where the Israelites and the Philistines camped. And it is right in the middle of the Israelite camp, in blue that you see there, that we're currently excavating a new site since 2007 that has really caused a new amount of data to come to play in this big debate. This is our Southern Adventist University team that was there this last summer in 2010. 62 staff and students from Southern were there working at Kirbet Kayafa. Together with the Hebrew University, we're standing inside the massive gate that was uncovered there, and we're working towards the south of that gate. We have another large group about the same size going this coming summer in 2011. The gate is massive. The first gate that was found in 2007, excavated in 2008 and 2009, has a threshold stone. You can see the threshold stone in white there at the main entrance. That threshold stone weighs between 8 and 9 tons. The stones used to build the gate structure itself, some of those stones weigh between 4 and 5 tons. Huge amount of labor was needed, and also engineering was needed to build these fortifications. Going off on either side from this gate structure are double walls. We call them casemate walls with rooms in between them. This is a typical Judaite type of architecture that we find at many other sites like Beersheba and Tel Bet Mirsam and Bet Shemesh and other surrounding areas as well. These casemate walls, these double walls, we estimate that the amount of stone used to build the surrounding wall, and we've excavated now about 10% of the site in the last several seasons, we estimate that 200,000 tons of stone were used just to build the fortifications. This is not a sheep pen. This is fortified. This is a fortified outpost on the border to Philistia that was very, very prominent and very important during its time. And the pottery that we find, as well as the radiocarbon dates that are coming from the floors of these buildings, dates to the time of David. And that has been very, very exciting to see. We've just gotten more carbon dates back from Oxford University. You can see the height of these walls as well and how well they're preserved by the volunteer that's standing inside here. These are very well preserved fortifications. And so the idea that there was no fortification during the time of David and Solomon is challenged now, not only from this site, but from other sites like Gezer that Andrews University excavated at several years ago, and other sites as well in the region. The pottery that's coming, we have a few Philistine pieces that look like this pottery here, but the majority of the pieces that are on the floors and that are fully restorable, we have now over 100 fully restorable storage jars, lamps, bowls, all kinds of different pottery that is coming out of this site. We have most of it is locally made. This is imported from Philistia, but most of it is locally made, is plain Judean ware, and is very typical from the early Iron Age 2A period, which is the time period of